In this video, I'm going to be offering a critique of the work of Clare W. Graves, popularized under the brand of Spiral Dynamics by Don Beck and Christopher Coven. This is Jurgen Rasmussen, by the way. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis blog. So before I go into the critique and offer what I perceive to be strengths and weaknesses of that particular framework, I want to just offer a little bit about my own background as relevant to this particular model. So first of all, I'm not an expert in anthropology or geography or history or political theory or anything like that. My context is I've spent the last 27 years seeing clients professionally, and that means that I spend my days seeing people who depress and who anxietize and who struggle with anger and rage and addictions and chronic pain and psychosomatic issues and that sort of stuff. So the only area that I would claim to have any real expertise is in the domain of change work and psychotherapy. So that's my context. A couple of other points here too. I am a lifelong martial artist and teacher of functional self-defense, so I'll be offering a kind of spiral perspective on that as well. And something else too. According to spiral dynamics theory, the Scandinavian countries are the center points of the late stages, meaning the place in the world where you most likely have the most people who have access to the later stages of the spiral, and where the culture and the social systems are more influenced by later stages of the spiral. So, given that I am born and raised in Norway, I bring that perspective to the table as well. So, Clare W. Graves was an American professor of psychology who taught at Union College in New York. And in the early 50s, that's when he started this particular research. He was, well versed in the theories of the time, Freud, Watson, Skinner, Carl Rogers. He was a contemporary of Abraham Maslow, and even on occasion when Maslow couldn't, do his own presentations, he would step in. And at that particular time, he got a lot of questions from students as to, which of these theoretical frameworks of psychology is the right one. And he got really frustrated because he couldn't really give an answer as to what was the right model of psychology. So he started asking people to write down the answer to a very specific question, and that is, what is a mature adult? And or what is a healthy psychological individual? And then he would have these judges, these other people, evaluate the written responses and see if they could find some sort of pattern. I don't know who these judges were, by the way. That's never quite become clear. But apparently, they found a pattern. So they found four, let's say, main systems or frameworks that people tend to use. And the pattern that they saw was that two of these systems were of a self sacrifice nature, and two of them were of a express self nature. So the first, or one of the systems that they found was sacrifice self now to get award later, and then very often in the afterlife. They found express self in a calculating, rational way. And then they found a system that was sacrifice self now for peer acceptance now. And they found a final one, which was express self, but not at the expense of anyone else. Express self so that all life can continue and benefit. And these systems were later called DQ or blue. That was the sacrifice self now for reward later system. Um, ER, that was Graves' code, or orange for the express self in a rational and calculated strategic manner. The FS or green system for sacrifice self now for peer approval now. And the GT system or yellow in spiral dynamics for express self, but not at the expense of others or your environment. And what he also found, what the judges found as a pattern, was that when people seem to evolve, they always seem to evolve in a particular way. So the earliest of these four systems was the blue system, the sacrifice self now for reward later system. When people evolved, that always changed into the express self in a rational, strategic way, the orange system. And when they evolved out of that, they would evolve into the sacrifice self now for peer acceptance now, which was the green system. And when people evolved out of that, they would evolve into the express self, but not at the expense of anyone else system, which was the yellow system. Not only that, they would also find, let's say, transition stages or sequences. So you could have a system where you had someone who was, let's say, nodal blue, but the next transition would be someone who had more blue but a little bit of orange. And then you would have someone who had more orange but a little bit of blue. You know, the orange was dominant. And then you would have the nodal orange. And then it would progress with, okay, mostly orange but a little bit of green, and so on and so forth. Later on, Graves would add a final system, which was the HU system, or what spiral dynamics called the turquoise system. And he only really had a handful of examples, but this seemed to be more of a self-sacrifice system again, of sacrifice self now for life and nature's existential realities. And he would later discover an earlier system, System 3, which he called CP, that the spiral dynamics folks call red, and that is a express self system, which is express self now impulsively and to hell with others. Later on, he would add the first two systems, which he had no direct experience of, but he found them through studying anthropology. And those were the AN, which spiral dynamics called beige, and the BO, that's Graves' code, which spiral dynamics called purple. Now, his theory then was that there is a emergent process that when people develop and they get more complex as a result of life conditions changing, that they would always evolve in a particular sequence, and that this sequence would alternate between these warm express self systems and then move over to a kind of cool sacrifice self system, and then the pendulum would swing back to a more complex express self system, and then swing back to a more complex sacrifice self system. So the worm systems then had a express self orientation, and they were more focused on the outer world and the individual, and they had more of an internal locus of control. The sacrifice self systems were more focused on the group and the collective and had more of an external locus of control. So, and something else which is really interesting too is that Graves and Don Beck and Christopher Coven would present this research as not only a theory of how every human being develops, if and when they develop, a complete model, so to speak, of the psyche, especially Don Beck. Christopher Coven, in my experience, had more of a sober relationship to this model, but Don Beck really presented it as a complete model of the human psyche, of these deep codes that when we looked at them and saw them for what they were, really offered a more or less complete roadmap of human psychological development so far. So not only was it presented as an individual model, but it was simultaneously presented as a model for how cultures and nation states even evolved over time. So, a quite ambitious claim, and quite incredibly, a claim based upon essentially asking university students one single question in a particular context. And you would have to imagine that most of these university students had relatively similar existential challenges in life or living conditions that were not that different. So I'm going to walk you through the stages, and then I'm going to offer a little bit about what I think are strengths and weaknesses again in this particular model. I should say I first came across this model back in 1998 when I did a NLP Master Practitioner training in Irvine, California with Tad James. Now, Tad James presented the work of Clare Graves and Spiral Dynamics. He did it in a kind of Reader's Digest way, and he did it more or less in the way that the integral philosopher Ken Wilber has written about spiral dynamics in his books. I didn't really take to it that much. It seemed like a kind of simplified, caricaturish model, so I didn't put too much stock into it. Then, about a decade later, in 2007, a very good friend of mine, Brian Mahoney, did a master practitioner course with Tad James, and he said, "Oh, Tad is really leaning on this spiral dynamic stuff." I was like, spiral dynamics. Well, why is he leaning that hard into it? Maybe there's something there I've missed. And I also started to read Ken Wilber during that time, and Ken Wilber was heavily promoting spiral dynamics in his books. So I got curious. I called Christopher Coven. I had a conversation with him, and I attended in, I think it was January 2008, an 8-day training in the UK with Christopher Coven and Natasha Todorovic on spiral dynamics. And then I saw more value in the model. I saw a deep, rich model about how different existential challenges or life conditions may inspire different value systems, frameworks for making meaning. One thing that made spiral dynamics for me a much more rich model when I was taught it by Christopher Coven compared to the Ken Wilber books and the Tad James seminars was that in the Wilber books and the Tad James seminars, they don't really make a distinction between values and how you value, between memes, which are concepts and ideas, and V memes, which is more the container, meaning how you value, how you think about it. So the first thing I think to kind of assess whether someone has a basic understanding of spiral dynamics or not is whether they make the distinction between memes and V memes. Are they making a distinction between values and the way you value? So let's jump into the stages. So the very first stage in Clare Graves' model, which he read about, he never encountered this, is what he calls the AN. That's his code. Spiral Dynamics called it beige. I'll be using the colors more because it's easier on the ear. This is this is a theory of how man operates in his most primitive stage. This is essentially a survival stage where man lives, assumedly, more or less like other animals in a kind of automatic, animalistic matter, a kind of reflexive matter where the concerns are only about survival. You know, there's no real inner life or perspective on oneself as an individual. It's all about reacting to physiological tension in the ways of hunger and thirst, and whether you're cold or hot, and the desire to have sex. So it's essentially food, fighting, fleeing, or fucking, essentially. Now, of course, we can't really take a time machine and back in time and ask these folks what it was like to be them. So I don't personally put that much stock into it, although Graves claimed that you could find people who operated at this particular stage some places. He would talk about, people with dementia, people who were getting senile, and some reports of shell shock during war, where people seem to revert back to this very basic state where there's really no thinking or awareness of self and no conception of time or space or anything like that. How fair a comparison that is, I don't really know. One book that Christopher Coven recommended and which I found interesting is a book called The Mountain People by an anthropologist called Colin Turnbull, who spent time amongst what was called the Eek people of Uganda. These were nomads, and they were people who allegedly had operated from a later stage, but had regressed back to this animalistic state due to very rough life conditions, where they were essentially losing the game of survival. And the people who wrote about the Eek people described them as the most despicable human beings on the globe. Colin Turnbull wrote about them as the loveless people. They seem to have no attachment to each other's, no partner love or parental love or love for their kids. They would steal food from their babies' mouths, literally. There's reports of parents who deliberately starved their kids to death, and when the children died, they would unceremoniously just throw the corpse out there for animals to eat, like no burial, nothing sacred about it, whatsoever. So there are some reports of some tribes living like that under very harsh conditions, and the interesting thing is that everything that we seem to associate with humanity, these are the qualities that the folks in the Eek tribe seem to lack. So at least it shows that this model that some people have, where they romanticize these early people or people who just live as part of nature, it's not necessarily all sweet and nice. The second system that Clare Graves called BO, that was his code, and which Spiral Dynamics popularized as purple. This is a system that you can more often find. And this is a very tribalistic system. Now, Graves actually later on in his life, after having read about it in anthropology literature, found examples of this. And I'm quoting here from his book, The Never Ending Quest, that he found them in the Tobacco Hills of Virginia, coal mine country of West Virginia, in the Arkansas Hills, in northern Maine, and in Indian tribes in America and Canada. So here you have a mode of being which is tribalistic. So this is a self-sacrifice system. It's a tribalistic way of orientation where spirits are everywhere. Everything has its spirits, and the spirits are making things happen. So in this form of meaning making, it's a kind of spirit magical world full of taboos and rituals and totems, uh, superstitions, where again spirits are in everything, and it's the spirits that make things happen. This is an orientation towards safety, of placating and appeasing these spirits. And as I said previously, it's very tribal. It's allegedly no sense of individuality. You can see quite a bit of purple, for example, in Africa. If you think back to the HIV crisis, where a lot of African men, had the thought that if they just have sex with a virgin, that would cure them. So one solution that Don Beck, by the way, had 64 trips to South Africa and claims that the spiral dynamics model was instrumental in helping dissolve the apartheid regime from the inside. I have no idea how true that is. That he worked closely with Frederick de Klerk and Nelson Mandela. But one of the solutions that he had offered, with some success allegedly, was to help these African men to view it as keep the bloodline pure. So in this system, you have people and not people based upon bloodline. If someone has gotten sick in a particular place, you then tend to avoid that particular place. And I don't know what association it is. It might be very unfair to these tribal people, but if you look at the work of people like Jean Piaget and child psychologists who write about this kind of magical phase of childhood, how much of a correlation there might be between the two, I don't know. Graves and spiral dynamics is a model of adult psychological development, not child development. But supposedly we all have this purple system in us to various degrees, even if we have transcended it. Oh, by the way, in the purple system too, you might get things like cannibalism, which, unless people are starving, as in the beige system, cannibalism is probably something that you would only see in the purple system. This is also where you would see, witchcrafts and curses and spells and this sort of magical thinking. Again, the thing here with the purple system is it's not thinking of spirits. It's sacrificing yourself, even though they don't really probably have a self to sacrifice in that sense, but sacrificing yourself to appease the spirits and the notion that the spirits are making everything happen. So according to Christopher Coven, when I trained with him, one of the reasons why Disney and Steven Spielberg and these sorts of things are so popular is because this is how many of us access purple. If you talk about wedding rings, Lucky Charms, brands, rituals, sporting events with teams and costumes, that these are healthy expressions of the purple system. Another interesting claim that Graves made, and again, I don't know how true it is, but he made the claim that people who have a high rejection of purple very often have family issues. Now, of course, everyone has family issues, so but that a high rejection of purple would indicate, problems with attachment bonds and relationship to family. Now, the next system, when so the theory here too is that when we solve, relatively speaking, our problems at one stage of development, some existential challenges, then new problems will always emerge. And if there's potential in the system, we will then tend to develop a new framework or a new meaning making system. So the next system then is the red system. And this is a system that you will see way more of. Graves again called it CP. Spiral Dynamics popularized it as red. And here you have a strong, warm, self-express system. You have the express self now impulsively, to hell with others. So this one is about expressing the self impulsively. It's now oriented, in the moment, meaning there is not really thought for future consequences. It's very egocentric. It tends to be hedonistic and orienting itself around quick, sudden wins and sensory pleasure. It's a dominate or be dominated type of system, control or be controlled. The drivers here tend to be power and domination and conquest. The person who operates here is essentially completely egocentric, and it's all about me. If you view this from a kind of martial arts perspective, I don't know if you've seen the Karate Kid movies, or the kind of remake, the Cobra Kai series on Netflix. But if you have, a nice reference for this could be, the series Cobra Kai, and the Cobra Kai dojo, and the sensei John Kreese. That would be a nice example of this red system. Um, if you watched reality TV shows, you see a surplus of this system, right? If you've seen The Ultimate Fighter, if you're into mixed martial arts, and if you look at like characters like Tank Abbott, or earlier the Diaz brothers, or a character like Ken Shamrock, where everything was about getting respect and dominating. Although he probably had a little bit of that blue system as well, that kind of warrior code. But in this system, there's there's really no guilt yet. There's no capacity for guilt, but there is a capacity for shame. So the big fear is to be shamed in some way, of losing honor and losing faith. Um, you might see this system a lot, obviously, in prison. Any prison population, you will see a domination of this red system. Um, if you go to rough bars, you'll see a domination of this particular system. A lot of people who struggle with drugs operate from this red system, not exclusively, obviously, but probably more of it, because if you don't really have access to, if you can't really bond with other people and have these more pro-social type emotions, if you can't get joy and warmth and a sense of connection that way, you can kind of get the pseudo version of it, off of drugs. Um, there is one red flag too for this particular system is of course the complete absence of any sense of personal responsibility. It's never my fault if I get in trouble. It's because I fell in with the wrong crowd. So avoiding shame, trying to dominate, trying to win. And there's very often a kind of hero mythology uh, when this red system is activated. Pain thresholds tend to increase. There's a disregard for future consequences. When people begin to orient out of this system, it is a oh, I should say also that you have a world of the haves and the have-nots in this particular system. So in terms of a society, on a group level, if the leading edge was red, or if most people were in that red system, you wouldn't really have you wouldn't have democracy, or something pretending to be democracy, which is of course is more what we actually have. You wouldn't have the state bureaucracy really. You would more likely have a feudal empire or a dictator, uh, competing competing gangs. You would have hit squads and gangsterisms and kind of thug-like mafia conditions, where the strong survive, where you have a few rough and tough individuals like the big boss who dominate, and then you have the have-nots who kind of try to, in a cunning way, manipulate to get what they can within their constraints. I worked as a consultant for the government back in the year 2000 and 2001. And of course, here I spent a lot of time with many, have nots. And many of these people were operating from that red system or some blend of red and blue, right? But these were not the power domination conquest types. These were more the people who promoted themselves through victimhood, and who would kind of try to maneuver and outwit and outfox the system by getting benefits, and by presenting themselves as victims, and thereby getting sympathy and benefits. So that's also a particular way that red can look. Now, the thing about this red system is that it's kind of a poor strategy for living a fulfilled life or for being happy, because if you impulsively act on a whim without thought for future consequence, that's a great recipe for being quite miserable. And other people will likely, get enough of you, because all relationships are adversarial, and the humor is hostile, and there's a very low level of trust, and people don't like being exploited. So after a while, people may age a bit, and they may, of course, everybody ages if they don't die, but they reach a point where, this isn't working too well for me. This isn't. What's the meaning behind this? And they may become aware, according to Graves, of their own mortality, and in that comes a need for order, and for meaning, and for stability. So then the person begins to shift from express self now impulsively, to hell with the consequences and other people, into the DQ or blue system, which is sacrifice self now for reward later. And this particular system is often more called the saintly self. Here you have again an emphasis on sacrificing yourself, suppressing and repressing your inner life, and tight control over social norms. Here people begin to express interest in religion, religious teachings. Here you often have the nationalism, the duty, honor country, my country, right or wrong, patriotism, the flag, becoming part of society, becoming part of a group. Instead of me against the world, it tends to be us versus them. And the big tendency tends to be to attack differences, to attack anything which is different. This blue system you will see all over the world in all sorts of cultures, from Japanese militarism and Zen, where the kamikaze soldiers would sacrifice themselves to the emperor. That's this blue system. Or if you look at Islam as an as a religious, political, economic, totalitarian ideology, you can translate the word Islam essentially into submission. If you look at Christianity, again, you're supposed to live a saintly, pure life now so that you can get into heaven and get reward in the afterlife. Um, this blue system tends to provide more of a civilized society, social stability. Here you might get Swiss craftsmanship, you get bureaucracy, these sorts of things. Nation states. Um, the devout Christian and the devout Muslim might be at war with each other, in terms of content, who has the right religion. But if you look at how they value, how they make sense out of things, you see that this same theme of sacrifice self for reward later expresses itself. And it's the same kind of black and white, absolutistic type thinking, with high loyalty to the in group and kind of hostility towards the out group, where the tendency is to attack differences. In terms of violence, um, the the purple system, will defend its territory, right? The red system might fight, just for fun, and as a form of self-expression, and to dominate someone. You may have killings. In the blue system, you have murder. You have nation states who are going to war for ideological reasons. If you look at phenomena such as honor killings, for example, this is an example of this blue system. My daughter, if I'm a devout Muslim, has married a Christian guy, or been raped by some infidel. This brings shame upon the family. So it's an honor killing. Authority here is external. There's an external locus of control. So it's God's will, or the will of the Communist Party. It doesn't have to be religious. It can also be more secular and atheist. So sacrifice self now for reward later. So if you look at not only the theocracies, but you look at, for example, the old communist states, whether it was the Chinese Communist Party, or the old Soviet the old Soviet Union, same type of mindsets. Authority is external. The culture tends to be traditional. The culture kind of writes for you what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a parent or a worker. You know, the manual tells you how you're supposed to do your job. If you look at it from a kind of martial arts perspective, if you go back to Cobra Kai again, or the Karate Kid movies, Mr. Miyagi and the Dojo. You know, here you see more of that blue, you know, traditional respect, honor, duty, punctuality, self-discipline, submit to the tradition, and do things the way that your master or your seniors have decided for things to be. So when this blue system, um, so they tend to frame the future in the context of the past. And in blue cultures and societies, you know, you're often born to your place. If you look at, for example, the Hindu caste system, where you are born to your place, or this, I can't quite remember what it was called. The word escapes me at the moment. But if you were of a particular caste in the Hindu system and your husband died, then the woman would get burnt alive and sacrificed. Uh, this is nodal blue, right? Rank has its privileges. People who are part of the religion, you know, have particular perks, and people who are non-believers, there's a completely different set of standards. Again, apartheid, racism, you know, as an ideology is a kind of collectivized ideology. Now, when people or cultures, so in the world today, again, you know, you see this blue system a lot in the theocracies and in the kind of communist states and very traditional societies. Now, this mode of being too is kind of limited. It suppresses our inner life. It's too tight. It suppresses individuality. It hinders progress. So when people and cultures then evolve, they tend to evolve into what Graves called ER, or the orange system. And this is a express self, but express self in a rational way, in a more strategic and calculated way. It's more of an emphasis on the difference between red and orange is that red is a express self now impulsively, whereas orange is express self strategically. Orange is red polished by blue. Christopher Coven used to talk about the Dutch disease, meaning that, you know, there's been some people in Holland, obviously, who couldn't see the difference really between red and orange. And for someone who truly operates at blue, it's going to be very hard to see the difference. In the blue system, you have an absolutistic thinking style where it's the one truth, and it's derived from very often a supernatural divine source, or the heads of the Communist Party. When people shift more into the orange thinking style, it's more a multiplistic way of thinking, meaning there are many ways of thinking, but one of them is probably right. So in this system, you have a very competitive comparative way of thinking. It's about changing things. It's about improving things. It's about upgrading and updating, upgrading the wife, upgrading the car, getting better technology, making more money, you know, developing yourself as a person, self-help. This, here, authority no longer lies within, a god or external authority. It lies more within the self, with experience, with experiments. Um, this sort of mind gave rise to the scientific method, the Industrial Revolution. Um, it's a very different way of operating. Now, if you think of it from a more martial arts perspective again, you could say that Bruce Lee, Bruce Lee had more of this ER type mindset of, you know, don't follow your sifu or your instructor, go wrestle, go box, go train jiu-jitsu, blend things, learn from different sources. It's your true and tried experience. You're the authority based upon your actual experience, where you as the individual get to kind of create your own style based upon what works for you. So there's more of a skepticism towards authority. There is, according to Graves, a kind of more disdain for empathy. Um, and it's very often concerned with status and competency. And life is a constant comparison, competition. And that comparison or scale doesn't necessarily have to be money or entrepreneurial. It could also be spirituality, the compulsion to become enlightened, for example. Might be an orange way of doing spirituality. There is often in the words of Albert Ellis a lot of masturbation going on in terms of a compulsiveness in terms of achieving and performing and having control. The attention tends to be on the outside world. When people are interested in psychology, it's often psychology in the service of achieving more. This is an achieving self, achieving more, getting more, upgrading. Think Tony Robbins and his materials, at least in the 80s and the 90s. I haven't really followed his work for a long time, but those old books, Awaken the Giant Within and Ultimate Power, it's a kind of psychological orientation, but it's a psychological orientation in terms of I create my reality. I can create the life that I want. Control your state so that you can increase your sales and earn more money and you get the dream house and seduce the trophy wife or whatever it might be. So if yeah, if you look at this from a kind of psychotherapeutic perspective, a lot of psychotherapy, here is about finding that inner voice and developing one's own sense of authority, one's own sense of I'm in charge. I have agency. I get to choose. I get to interpret. I get to improve. I get to choose my own way. I more get to choose what type of parent I want to be or what type of relationship I want to be in. In the orange system, you're more often born to your place. In the orange system, you more get to decide your own place. It's a kind of, to use Ian McGilchrist's terminology, it's a kind of a more left hemispheric, cold, quantitative way of living. So the next system, when people move out of the orange ER system, is according to Graves that they move into the FS system or the green system. And this is, people may have succeeded. They may have their big house and their two cars, and they have money in the bank, and they have a good career, and they have the status symbols, but they kind of discovered that they're worn out. They're not really happy. People might respect them, but not really like them. They don't really know their kids anymore. Um, so what tends to change here is that instead of this multiplistic thinking achiever self, online comes a more socio-centric self, where being essentially is valued more than achieving or having. It's a softer orientation where there's an increased sensitivity towards the inner world of understanding yourself and understanding others and getting curious about who they really are and who you really are in relation to the world. And it's more about connecting and belonging and being part of a community. So at this stage of development, feeling and sensitivity is valued more than cold, hard logic and facts. Collaborating and connecting is valued more than competing and standing out. Having class or good taste is valued more than just crass materialism. There's subjectivity is valued more than objectivity. There's there's more access again to the inner world of feelings, to the inner world of one's own subjective experience. And people tend to adopt a more relativistic orientation. Okay, so I have my take, but you have your take, and that's equally valid. Who am I to judge and say that my particular way of thinking or culture is somehow better than yours? It's just different. So there's a seeking to see how other people view the world. There's more of a contextualism to see yourself in relation to others and in relation to the environment and the universe at large. So truths are more contextual. There's more a situationalism, and there's according to Graves, the tendency for fighting and violence, homicide seems to stop at this stage. There's an emphasis on not hurting anyone, at least not physically. But it tends to, again, according to Graves, to have the highest suicide rates. There can be a high preference for fools and a strong emphasis on consensus and group majority rule, and you can get a kind of excess of political correctness at this particular stage of development, a kind of collectivized guilt, of feeling collectively responsible for what's going on with people in other places of the world and what, my race or our people have done to other people, and maybe we should make amends. A more interconnected way of viewing the world. But simultaneously, ironically, as Graves would say, these people talk a lot about other people and compassion. There's often people often get more interested in stuff like consciousness and meditation and yoga and protecting the environment and these sorts of things. And there's a lot of talk about, protecting other people and caring and being compassionate, but that the people who operate here very often have a strong problem in really committing to other people emotionally, and that they often have a rough time really formulating a coherent, proper English sentence. And another thing, according to Graves as well, was that even though you have the relativism and the kind of both and logic, yes, this can kind of be true, but this can be true simultaneously. Niels Bohr had a great quote, which probably corresponds well to this. And he said something to the effect that there's two types of truth, in the and this is an exact quote, but in the kind of shallow truth, the opposite of what is true is false. But in the deeper truth, the opposite, the seemingly opposite of what is claimed to be true, is equally true. But according to Graves, this system was authoritarian as hell, as in, you better comply. It's a person who seems to have given up his sense of self for peer approval. So all values and norms and ethics are kind of derived from his or her peer group, and can change overnight. If the atmosphere of the group changes, then the individual's changes. The individual's values will change, as well. And that if you're not part of the group, then you really have no valid claims to anything but what the group kind of decides. So a quite authoritarian, authoritar authoritarian mindset. Of course, this green or FF system, which you can see quite a bit of in Scandinavia, for example, where I live, and in Western Europe and Australia, New Zealand, parts of the United States and Canada, is supposed to be a very transitory system and a quite vulnerable system because it doesn't work that well. It's this system where you begin to think that everyone's nice and everyone's kind and all cultures are equal, and it's hard to make the decisions because you have to get consensus. And we see this, for example, in Europe now with our immigration policies, where we have taken huge amounts of people into, for example, the Scandinavian countries from societies where you have a lot of blue and red, and hardcore Islam, blue. And we're having an extremely rough time integrating many of these folks into this, more technocratic and information based society. This is a huge problem. This green system that doesn't really deal well with stuff like that. So off we go into the next system, and then when people develop here, it's a new system that Graves called GT in his earlier writings. Spiral Dynamics calls it yellow. And this is a express self system again. Express self, but not at the expense of others. Express self in a way that allows all of life to continue and to flourish. So it's an express self system, but it's not egocentric in the same way. It's more a systemic self. What is happening to this system that I am a part of? One main difference between the kind of orange self system and the yellow self system is that the orange system more often has, I must achieve, I must perform. the yellow system has a more, I'd like to perform. I'd like to achieve. According to Graves, the two main markers of this yellow system is that compulsion is gone and fear is gone, relatively speaking. As he used to say, you have a person who has ambition but is no longer ambitious. You have a person who has preferences but really no longer has any compulsion of having to perform or having to be liked or needing to be approved of. And this reduction in fear and compulsiveness frees up a lot of psychological space. In fact, when Graves did these experiments where he would have groups of GT or yellow who would get together to solve problems, and then you would have people from the blue, orange, and green groups. Um, the yellow group did better than all the other groups combined. But when they were tested for, IQ scores, they were not brighter in the conventional sense, but they were still a lot smarter. And this likely has a lot to do with more conceptual space and compulsions being gone, and relatively speaking, fears being gone. If you're dealing with a person here, you'll see that a lot of the competitiveness, that kind of competitive, comparative mind, isn't really operating online. The need for belonging and social validation, those fears are gone. Um, you'll see less status symbols, less of that kind of personal competition or needing to dominate. You get a more curious person who just wants to express his or her competencies, who's just looking for a functional fit. They just want to express their competencies on their terms. And they're not looking to dominate anyone else. And they're not looking to be dominated by anyone else either. Their orientation seems to be more one out of curiosity to understand, learning, becoming naturally. They tend to not impose themselves on other people. And with the ER person, they tend to more often kind of, according to Graves, demand the spotlight and have this fantasy of changing the world. If only they would let me sit with the monitors, I would impose my vision. I would change things. I would do this. I would do that. The yellow person would probably not accept the job that they wouldn't do well. They're more aware of their own limitations. They probably wouldn't want to be president. So they tend to drop out of corporations and large organizations. And quite often they just drop out and kind of do their own thing and try not to fuck up or contribute more to the mess that we collectively seem to be in. They tend to only do things that they find interesting. And instead of the kind of both and logic, there's more of a and logic, as in, this is approximately true in a particular context, and this is approximately true, and this is approximately true. A respect for mapped territory distinctions, a deep awareness that any model is partial and incomplete, hence the and logic. According to Graves, people affection tends to decrease when people operate from this particular system. Um, and then, according to Graves again, when people change and move out of this system, they move into what he called the HU system in his early writings, and he called it turquoise. And the thing about turquoise is that he only had like 5 or 6 samples or entries. So he didn't really have any data on turquoise. He just had a few people who seemed to make sense in a way that went beyond that seventh level. And it seemed to be, it seemed to be, so he had this theory about first tier and second tier. So the first tier would be beige, purple, red, blue, orange, and green, the kind of systems that we've talked about. And then this massive jump into this second tier, yellow GT system, which he would view as a kind of, okay, we're back to the AN system. We're back to surviving in a new way. And according to his theory, then, turquoise would be a more advanced version of purple. So again, a more tribalistic or collectivistic way of viewing the world, a kind of sacrifice self way of viewing the world again, a sense of being deeply interconnected, but where the self is no longer the center point. But it's quite interesting because you know you have a lot of people who make videos and who write books and who refer to turquoise. But again, Graves hardly had any data about it. Now, when living conditions change, will most likely new meaning making or value systems emerge? Sure. Um, but the people who write about turquoise and credit Graves' research, Graves is not really the source of that. Not only that, you even have people writing about third tier and coral, and they have a lot of stuff that they write and share, and they claim that it has something to do with Graves and spiral dynamics, but again, Graves didn't even really have any data for turquoise or the HU system. So, what are some of the strengths and benefits of this, as far as I can see it? And again, I'm coming from a kind of Scandinavian lens. I'm coming from a psychotherapeutic context, not an expert of geography or history or political science or anything like that. So I'm gonna I'm going to kind of set aside uh, Graves level one, you know, the whole beige system, because I mean I don't really know. I don't really have access to it. I don't really have much of a take either on the BO or purple system because I just haven't seen a lot of it. Uh, Neither had Graves, coincidentally. Now, here's an interesting thing. I have a friend called Ryan Simby Jenkins, who's a hypnotherapist and change worker located in Barcelona, who his mother was a medical anthropologist, and she discovered, I say she discovered, they actually reached out, you know, to the world. The last known, I believe, ancient tribe to be discovered. This was in the early 80s in Papua New Guinea, and they were called the Hagahai people. And Ryan was raised and lived among the Hagahai people until he was about 12. And I've had the chance to have a couple of conversations with him about, you know, how they operated and lived and think and stuff like that. And Ryan has looked into spiral dynamics and he said that, yeah, you know, it fits well with a kind of purple reddish type orientation. So that is kind of interesting. So in terms of this stuff, you know, Graves would claim that, you know, let's say someone operates from orange as their leading edge. They have the previous systems in their neurology and their psychology. You can view it a bit as a stick shift thing on a car that, depending upon the context, people might activate different systems. And let's say someone who operates at orange, they may have weak access to purple, quite strong access to red, kind of diminish blue, and a lot of orange. Versus the next person might have not that much red, but a lot of orange, even though their leading edge is blue. So these are not types of people. They are systems of people where in different people, different constellations of these systems may be more or less active. I think it's a very interesting model in the sense that it ties together that different existential challenges and environment might inspire very different value systems. Um, you can see this today, in parts of Africa, as I mentioned, you have more of that purple orientation, that tribal. You have that red system, in feudal empires and places of the world, ghettos, places where you have perhaps more poverty and rougher places to live. You have more dominant blue in authoritarian theocracies and Eastern European countries and stuff like that. And you have, if you have, for example, an orange mindset, if that's the orientation of the population, yeah, you're going to likely have more capitalism and or corporatism. You're likely going to have things that look a bit more like a democracy, even though it isn't really. But let's call it a democracy. You're likely to have more universal human rights, a more capitalistic system. You're likely to have more entrepreneurship and more choice and more freedom of speech and these sorts of things than you would have, for example, had you lived in a more traditional society. And if you look at, for example, the Scandinavian systems, you see more of that green system um, coming across. Um, I think I think that this model is a likely a better model for societies and cultures and how nation states develop from tribes to feudal empires to traditional societies to more free market corporate states to more value communities as people go from a more tribal, egocentric um, group mind to a more rational mind, etc. I think if you try to apply spiral dynamics to individuals, it's way more messy. I've studied in depth Robert Keegan's model of development and Jane Lovinger's model of ego development that has been expanded by Susan Cook-Reuter. I think that these models, uh, they all leave a lot of stuff out. They're all models. They're nothing to be taken literally, but they're more clean in a sense. They focus more on process than content. And I think that, so for example, this idea that everyone's going to, that we're always going to go from like an express system to a sacrifice self system to an express system, might that often be the case? Sure. Do I think that it's a universal pattern and that it will always be so? No, not at all. And at later stages of development, these concepts of express self and sacrifice self and other increasingly are seen as constructs too, anyways, as the sense of self gets bigger. Uh, what this model, in my opinion, too, doesn't emphasize enough is how males and females, and also people with different temperaments and personality tendencies, you know, might express these systems. So if we start with the CP system, for example, and I'm quoting here from Graves' book, The Never Ending Quest, So under CP, or the red system, to hell with others. Don't give a damn about others. Well, if you look at how the red system is described by Graves and Beck and Coven and other writers, you will see that there are virtually no female examples. And if this is a universal stage of development, all the examples are things like James Bond villains and Attila the Hun and people like Andrew Tate. Of course, he wasn't around when but his followers, that type of mindset, that sort of like dominate, power, conquest, the impulsive street thug, or uh, but I think if you look at it from I'll take on my psychotherapy hat here and ask someone who worked a year for the government with the long-term unemployed. I think if you look at this from a more feminine perspective, females are way less likely to try to dominate and to conquer, using force and physicality and violence. It's more going to be about gossip and attacking people's reputation, ruining people's reputation, verbally. So, in my experience, a lot of people, especially females who operate from this system, they tend to more surround themselves with the language and identity of being a victim, of being a vulnerable victim. And they try to gain the system and get advantages by appealing to other people's empathy, in that sense. And they might try to control and dominate people by using the language of, for example, these woke ideologies, where they try to cancel other people and destroy their livelihood and get them fired from their jobs and ruin their reputations by using the terminology of Vogue to dominate other people and to get resources. So that's one thing. So I think that the model needs more descriptions of how a female might express this system. Now, something else too, when you look at how the red system is described, it sounds like a psychopath. It sounds like a person who's high in dark tetrad traits, Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy, and sadism. Now, if you look at psychopathy, for example, you see that it's a constellation of personality tendencies. Someone who's kind of impulsive, so they score low on conscientiousness. Someone who has like a kind of fearless, bold, assertive personality style, which would be high on aspects of extroversion and low on neuroticism, meaning a low fear response, and a kind of callous, cold, unfeeling temperament, which would be really low on agreeableness. Now, culturally, of course, people like that would rise to the top in a feudal empire. They would end up being the haves in a might is right, dog eat dog kind of world. But individually, if this is a psychological stage that everyone goes through, how do people go through this stage of development if they don't have that temperament? If they don't have those particular personality tendencies. This is going to be your teenager or your young adult, living in your household. It might look very different. It's still going to be egocentric. It's still going to be self-serving, but it might look very different. You might, for example, have a person who operates here who has an interest in being a very good friend or a very heroic person. And that might be the person who walks the old ladies over the street and who dives into the fire and acts like a hero to impulsively to at high risk for himself to save someone else out of the fire. It This system might look very differently if you view it in a structural way and you open up for the idea that people with different temperaments and personality tendencies might express a egocentric way of meaning making that doesn't do future consequences well and is quite impulsive and doesn't take context into account, but it might look very, very different. So that's one of my criticisms. Another criticism I have is, of course, Graves did his work starting in the 50s, and he was in the United States. And as a guy who's grown up in Norway, one of the things that always stunned me when I go to the States is just how seriously people take religion. People, hardly anyone here does that, at least where I live. We just don't have that cultural surround. It's more agnostic and more atheistic. Of course, we're getting more people of the Muslim faith in as part of these immigration policies. But so it would make sense that when people come out of the red system, that they move into a kind of saintly form of self that's all about self-sacrifice to gain reward later, because Christianity had such a strong foothold on the United States. And I mean, culturally, yes, this seems largely to be true. It seems largely to be true that people go through a kind of blue phase. However, today, 2024, if you grew up in, well, I live just outside of Oslo in Norway, our blue looks more like often like Graves' FS system. So I'll find this here. This is from Graves' book again, The Never-Ending Quest. The individual absorbs self into the group and in essence becomes the group. Now, this is just like Keegan's socialized mind, by the way. I think this is a better description of what happens before people have developed an independent psychological self. So people here, when they move out of that red system and they kind of get socialized, they're more likely to adopt, these more green values of environmentalism and feminism and multiculturalism and saving animals and having a big welfare state and these sorts of things. But they'll hold those values in an absolutistic way, which of course it's not. In the Western world today, I think, when people move out of the red system, sure, it might look like Graves' description of the blue system, but I think it could just as easily look more like that FS green system, at least here in Scandinavia. Now, someone might get socialized into a more, let's say, right-wing or conservative type ideology, or they might get socialized into a multiplicity of different ideologies. And They're kind of constructing their sense of self based on becoming parts of those societies and having those societies become parts of them. And they might still attack differences and be very group oriented. And life is about belonging and peer approval. But again, I think this is a more likely description of what's likely to happen after moving out of the red system, at least here in Scandinavia. I said this to Chris Coven, by the way, and he said, "Well, Jurgen, with all due respect, Norway isn't really representative of the world." I said, "Yes, you're right." But I think this is increasingly correct, as we, as, the Western world develops. So I think that's a kind of limitation of the model as well. I also think that Graves's idea of no one has no one has a right to anything but what the group determines, and that all values are derived from the group, and if the group changes its values, then the individual will change its values. This to me is not a psychologically mature person who has moved beyond, let's call it, self authorship or that achieving mind. It's more representative of someone who hasn't moved into that form of mind to begin with. At least that's the way it looks to me from the vantage point of seeing clients all day and seeing how people seem to develop psychologically. Now, regarding the orange system, yeah, I think it seems pretty accurate. Although I would say this, and that is that, as Keegan points out, when someone develops more of that self-authoring mind, and I know that Graves and Keegan are different models, but bear with me here. You know, some people might become more relationship oriented, actually, in this phase of life, and that becomes their project and their identity. It's not necessarily going to be the outside world of accomplishment and conventional achievement. I also think there's a limitation here in, I remember, uh, if you look at the original Spiral Dynamics book by Beck and Coven, and they give examples of orange, you see, things like Rodeo Drive and the fashion industry, and they talked about Paris Hilton, and Ayn Rand. And I'm like, hold on. I remember saying to Chris at the seminar, I said, are you really putting Paris Hilton and Ayn Rand at the same stage of psychological development? And he said, yes. Well, of course, Ayn Rand is likely more intelligent and stuff like that. But I have an issue with this, and I'll tell you why. They might both have been, let's call it, achievement oriented, but if spiral dynamics is about how you value something and an increase in your capacity to kind of think about your thinking, and of course I don't know Paris Hilton, but there is a difference, I think, between someone who's just kind of socialized into a capitalist system and they do their best to attain status and to get ahead and earn money and in that system, versus a philosopher like Ayn Rand who had taken a step back and could have perspective on capitalism, on metaphysics, on epistemology, and had her own capacity to reflect upon these things. That is, as I view it, a different form of mind, a more mature adult mind that might find a home in Keegan's conception of self-authoring mind. But I don't really see how spiral dynamics and the ER system has a really a solid conceptualization of what it means to be a adult psychologically. You know, they talk about characters like J.R. Ewing from the TV show Dallas. You know, when they put him in the same category as Ayn Rand. And I think when we move into the FS Green system, you know, what I see working with clients is that, yeah, I see that shift quite often. People who have prioritized their career, they've earned money, they've accomplished, and they feel like they no longer, know their kids. They so there's a change in prioritizing being over having, becoming more in touch with their own subjective world, becoming more doubtful, becoming more curious about other people and wanting to connect. These things are true. But as Suzanne Cook-Reuter points out in ego development theory, she has a they have a stage there called the individualists. She says that when people move into that more relativistic appreciation of context way of thinking, they don't necessarily become more communal. Quite often they become very individualistic and very much in the now, and it's all about my inner experience and connecting with that. And I think spiral dynamics way too much, and this is based upon this idea that people will always spiral between these warm and cold systems, automatically equates relativistic, contextual, situational, both and logic with kind of left leaning socialist progressive policies. And I think Susanne Cook-Reuter is right on this one. And I see this in my practice too. I see that people don't necessarily adopt more of those green values at all. And I often see more of those green values in people who haven't yet reached the orange stage. And I see a lot of people who base their own identity and try to compete based upon adopting those more green values. So I think that's a huge weakness. And of course, when it comes to the yellow system, I definitely think that that stage of development, exists, that more systemic and logic, you know, person who's more driven by competency, who wants to just express his competency and has more of a minimalist, less status seeking, approval, compulsion being gone, fears being reduced. Yes, absolutely. Although, I do wonder also how much of that conceptualization is necessarily based upon systemic thinking, even though it may very often be, and how much of it might just be a person who has the personality tendencies of being kind of high in openness, so they're very curious, and low in neuroticism. And I think if someone's low in neuroticism and high in openness, they might easily come across that way. And if they're not that competitive and you know, and I very often, when I first heard about that system, I thought about Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy. He seemed to write and to operate that way, and one of the things that Chris emphasized in the seminar is the difference between GT or yellow being I I'd like to know, and ER or orange being I have to know, I must know. RABT, Ellis' system of psychotherapy, very much revolved around helping people reduce their masturbatory compulsive fear-based tendencies and turn them into these healthy preferences instead. And I think I've seen quite a few times by doing RABT inspired psychotherapy, people go from seeming orange to quite yellow without necessarily moving through that FS phase at all, just by doing that type of psychotherapy. So that's also something else to consider. Anyways, I hope this was useful and inspiring. I highly invite you to check out Spiral Dynamics if you haven't. It's a rich, interesting model. If nothing else, it will help enrichen and enliven your inner world and your understanding of people and culture and society. Then I recommend the books The Never Ending Quest by Clare Graves, and also a book called The Levels of Existence, uh, edited by Lee, but it's about the work of Clare Graves. Oh, a little bit of housekeeping. If you're watching this in 2024, know that I'm doing a 1 day masterclass on how to work with clients with anger problems. If you're watching that before September 28th, you can check out the seminar at provocativehypnosis.com. I'm also doing a psychological illusion model online seminar in October. If you're interested in that, check it out. And if you're interested in mentoring or change work, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. As always, thanks for listening.